Welcome back to Boyd Book Club, tackling episode 4 of semester 2 today and dealing with our, what I like to refer to as knowns, unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And obviously in this case I am evoking some of the words that Donald Rumsfeld used in the lead up to the Iraq War. The idea here is that we want to get into and discuss within orientation those things that are often glossed over, and in particular, cultural tradition. We can think about this in one of several ways. There's discussion of both cultural evolution and cultural inheritance in the academic literature that is particularly interesting. There is the discussion of mimetic theory, and mimetic theory is first proposed by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene, which I think is a very worthwhile read. I could go back and forth in some of my various opinions about Dawkins, but I think that his contribution to both the world of cultural evolution and cultural and evolutionary psychology is worth discussing. It's worth looking at, and mimetic theory certainly plays a part in that. What we are talking about when we talk about cultural tradition in the context of Boydian thinking is those systems of belief, those things that we consider obvious, and those things that we are incapable of learning because of the culture that we have been raised in, the culture that we have evolved in, and what it is capable of doing. So let's talk a little bit about where cultural tradition fits into the OODA loop and how it applies to us on multiple levels. When we talk about cultural tradition, I like to begin that discussion by talking about where we fit into 3 different tiers of culture. At the highest and most abstract level, that is the political or national culture that we fit into. So, given the fact that many people that are watching this are from the United States, we'll talk about it in the context of being from the United States. We have a particular national character that we believe, a narrative that we believe is our national culture. There are a lot of knowns, there are some unknowns, and there are some unknown unknowns within that. And we could spend quite a bit of time tearing those individual notions apart. I encourage you to go out and read a handful of books. A People's History of the United States is a really good one. Lies My Teacher Told Me is another good one that put into context the idea, that often used expression, that history is written by the winners, and that ultimately part of what happens in our education at a national level is the codifying of a story, the codifying of a narrative about who we are as a people. The next level below that is what I would call the tribal or local level. If we think about tribalism in the context of evolutionary psychology, we bump up against something known as Dunbar's number. And Dunbar's number has some variation, but it says roughly that you are capable of caring about, having an intimate concern for around 150 people. And the idea of this is that Robin Dunbar, who is a biologist and who has studied evolution, has found that among large-brained primates, that their tribal circle seems to be predicted by the size of the neocortical regions of their brain and their brain volume. And that if you look at various ape families, if you look at human brain capacities and look at these predictive calculations, what it will tell you is that the human brain seems to be capable of caring for about 150 individual people. That is what would make up our tribe. When we talk about culture, we have to recognize that while we have evolved a political or a national culture, we also have a tribal or local culture. I live on the south side of Chicago, and there is a definite cultural difference between the south side broadly and the north side broadly. But there is a different tribal culture within the individual neighborhoods within Chicago. There is a different tribal culture within the various Catholic parishes of Chicago, and many other large communities see these same sorts of divisions. And those individual cultural norms play a role in what we know, what we don't know, and what we are unaware we don't know about the world around us. The third tier, the one that we live with in the most intimate relationship, is our familial culture, the cultural traditions that we have established within our nuclear families and within our extended families, and the way those stories, those narratives, those philosophies, that ethos informs who we are and what we do. All three levels of this culture play a role in what we will come to understand and what we will come to know. That brings us now to talking about this week's assigned reading, the culture industry document by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. These two gentlemen are known principally for their involvement with what has become known as the Frankfurt School, the philosophical home of critical theory. So in the culture industry text that we read, Adorno and Horkheimer open with this expression: the sociological theory that the loss of the support of objectively established religion, the dissolution of the last remnants of pre-capitalism, together with technological and social differentiation or specialization, have led to cultural chaos, is disproved every day, for culture now impresses the same stamp on everything. What Adorno and Horkheimer set out to do in this piece is to paint a picture for us of how a globalized culture, a culture industry as they describe it, is beginning to remove the variance that we see in the national, in the tribal, and in the familial cultural traditions that we have historically evolved within and grown up with. Their theme, and one of the central themes of critical theory, is that this is in furtherance of the monopolistic capitalistic practice. Horkheimer and Adorno, their fellows at the Frankfurt School, are neo-Marxists. This is something that generates a lot of discord in any conversation about critical theory. And I think that this point is one that is worth spending a moment on. Why is it that individuals immediately have a visceral reaction when one brings up critical theory if they are not already inclined to examine the world through this neo-Marxist outlook? Well, the reason is that in the West, and in America in particular, we have a very pejorative view of Marxism, generally because we don't understand it, in my opinion, or we completely disagree with it. However, I think most people who disagree with Marxism do so implicitly. They do so out of an implicit cultural tradition focused on what they have been raised to believe. And this is rooted in our cultural tradition. This antipathy towards cultural theory and any sort of Marxist or neo-Marxist idea, I believe, is rooted in America's fundamental culture and ideology, which is one of business. If you look at what we describe as the American dream, right? It is the idea that you can come here and make something of yourself, that you can have opportunities to build assets, wealth, the capacity to be an independent actor. All of these are rooted in traditional notions of capitalism. For Horkheimer and Adorno, for culture now impresses the same stamp on everything. And for them, in this case, they mean the culture industry. This is Hollywood. This is fashion. This is the distribution of stylized, idealized propaganda, for lack of a better term, to a wide mass of individuals. This idea is taken up in a really good film called They Live. It's one of John Carpenter's early films, and it is about a character who, with the benefit of a magic tool, his sunglasses, is able to see past the trappings of society, the propaganda of society, to see deeper into the cultural system that is behind us, right? Obey and conform, submit, no thought, all of these ideas that are what Adorno and Horkheimer are referring to when they talk about the culture industry. And we come now to the last sentence in the Adorno-Horkheimer text. The most intimate reactions of human beings have been so thoroughly reified that the idea of anything specific to themselves now persists only as an utterly abstract notion. Personality scarcely signifies anything more than shining white teeth and freedom from body odor and emotions. The triumph of advertising in the culture industry is that consumers feel compelled to buy and use its products even though they see through them. For those of you who are fans of Last Week Tonight, John Oliver recently did an episode on warehousing and focused particularly on Amazon. Many of us recognize quickly through news stories, through pieces like the Last Week Tonight piece, that conditions within the Amazon warehousing network, their system, are terrible for workers. And yet, we will go and click buy it now on Amazon because a system, an industry has come up in place which plays to so many of our implicit drives and gives us a sense of fulfillment. We will deal with the known and disregard it. In the same way that most of us recognize that the products that we consume that are made in China in particular are made by individuals who are being paid incredibly poor wages, who are living in abject poverty at times, and who are creating for us devices of affluence. I went out and bought this iPhone XS when my 5S died just recently and spent $1,300 on a phone. $1,300 that I spent on a phone. I could go in and do the math on what the workers who assembled the various components and mined the minerals that were needed and whatnot were paid. But ultimately, I know that it is a fraction of a percentage of what I spent. I knew that as I was purchasing it, and yet I chose to purchase it anyway. That is the pervasive nature of the cultural industry as Adorno and Horkheimer are talking about it. Why do I choose to use the Adorno-Horkheimer text to bring up this idea of cultural tradition and discussing it? It is this simple reason. For many people, it will get their back up. They will become incensed in reading this text. And the hope is that if you are upset by reading this text, that you will begin to question why. You will question why you purchase things the way you do. You will question why you're upset by the text the way you are. Or, if you're not upset by it, you will question why you're not upset by it, why you accept it as true, and yet are not participating in a system to do anything differently. This is assuming you're not. Maybe you are on the vanguard of the anti-capitalist frontier. I apologize. I use the Adorno and Horkheimer text because it creates a dissonance, because it requires us to examine what we know, what we don't know, and those things that we don't know, our knowns, our unknowns, and our unknown unknowns. It forces us to delve into culture in a way that we're not often asked to do in Western society and American culture in particular. We come back then to the OODA loop itself and the centrality of orientation and the roles that these filters of orientation play. We spoke last week about genetic heritage and how genetic heritage is something that we have essentially no control over, that we have some control over our acute biological environment by how we live, how we have prepared ourselves for that biological environment. But ultimately, our genetic heritage is a fixed thing. Our cultural tradition is more of a fixed thing than it is not. Whether we actively rebel against certain aspects of the dominating culture, we are still forced to live within it. Sean and I, in our business philosophy that you can find on the Adult Academy page, talk about the fact that we believe information should be free. And one of the reasons that we create much of our content for YouTube or write articles that we post on the websites, things like that over time, without them being behind a paywall, is that we believe that that information ought to be free. And yet, as we say, Wells Fargo still expects us to pay our mortgage. In order to create these videos, I still have to go and spend money on the various tools that I use. Or that's why we use Patreons to help support it, because while we believe the information needs to be free, it still costs us money to distribute it. All of us recognize these things as truths, and especially those of you who are supporting this on Patreon recognize it as a truth. That's why you are supporting us, and I thank you for it. However, this is an example where, despite our individual beliefs about the need to put good quality information into the world that is there to be consumed by any and all without it being behind a paywall, we still must live within a cultural system that demands that these things cost money. This is just one example. And there are many examples of cultural traditions that are worth examining. One that I would encourage you to begin your questioning with is what often gets referred to as lies we tell to children. What are some examples of lies we tell to children? I'm going to encourage you to have your children leave the room if they're currently listening and you are prone to suggest certain ideas to them that you may know don't have a basis in fact. Pause the video and get them out of the room and then come back. I'll assume now that it is okay for us to continue to talk as knowledgeable adults, right? What is, in the Western culture, what is the number one lie we tell to children? Right? This is a concept. It is one that we use to demonstrate benevolence, that we use to demonstrate goodwill. It is one that we use to encourage certain behaviors. And yet, it is the principal lie we tell to children. What are the other lies we tell to children? What are the lies that were told to us? What are those things that we believe without question? When we talk about understanding cultural tradition in the context of our decision-making process, we must question those things that we have come to believe. We must tease apart those belief systems. There are two questions that I encourage people to ask. Is it so? When we begin to say, we offer a statement that comes off as factual, or someone else offers us a statement that they purport is factual. The question I encourage us all to ask is it so? Is this fact? Or is this a belief? And where does that borderland occur? The second question that I encourage us all to ask as we explore not only cultural traditions, but also our previous experiences is this. So what? Does this apply? There are things that are true statements of fact, and yet they don't apply to our current dynamic. They don't apply to our current situation. And in tearing apart our understanding of cultural tradition, these two questions, I think, are incredibly important. Is it so, and so what? Examining our cultural traditions, I think, is probably one of the most difficult aspects of truly getting into understand how we think and why we think the way we do. But that is critical. It's essential if we are going to leverage the OODA loop as a tool and not merely as a descriptive device. If it is going to offer us a way of improving our decision-making capacity, then we must acknowledge the role that cultural tradition plays and dive into it deeply, even though it may be the most difficult deep dive we take. As always, thank you for taking some time out of your day to spend with me. I truly appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time to reflect on these ideas and offer your thoughts in the discussion board below. Please make this a community. Make this a discussion. Thank you to the Patreons for your support. Truly, without that support, it would be almost impossible for me to devote the time that I need to making these videos. Thank you. I'll see you soon. Cheers.